Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio.
Happy Friday, I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And I'm Holly Fry.
We talked about some autoimmune diseases.
Sure did. Very real ones.
Real autoimmune diseases that we're talking about because I'm so mad at RFK Jr. I listened to this entire speech because I wanted, I just had seen clips of it where he was saying that he had never heard of juvenile diabetes when he was a kid. And I was like, buddy, is it because the kids that you would have known would have died because treatment was not as available or understood when you were growing up? By that point, insulin did exist. Children with diabetes were living a lot longer by the 50s and 60s, but it's still, we have progressed since then. That is a thing that could have happened. But so I listened to this entire thing so that I could make note of all of the other things that so here are some more things that he said he had never heard of besides the ones that we mentioned in the episode. Eczema.
What? I mean, you're braver than me because I can't handle watching all of it. I'll read a transcript, but I can't.
I did watch it on 2 times speed so that it would be over with faster.
And I think this came out while I was in Japan, and I was just
you were in Japan.
La 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 la. I'm gonna live in Japan for the moment and not get too wadded up in things back home.
Yeah. So after seeing the clip in which he mentioned juvenile diabetes, which isn't called that anymore, I sought out the whole thing. So in addition to the things that we talked about, eczema, ADD and ADHD. I don't remember exactly when those were first defined. But then speech and language delay. Okay, that's a whole category.
Right.
Autism, Tourette syndrome, and then autoimmune diseases, another whole category. And I was just like, man, but some of these things are more recently described, but then you look back in history and you see evidence of them earlier on.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of stuff like ADHD and autism, there is growing awareness, which means more people are being diagnosed when they may not have been diagnosed earlier on because that awareness wasn't there.
Right.
And if you look at charts of things over time, sometimes there will be increases in diagnoses of things like autism and ADHD, but declines in more broad diagnoses of things like developmental delay.
Right.
So a child that would have been diagnosed with something like developmental delay, which is very general and broad, instead being diagnosed with something more specific, like autism spectrum disorder.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff there. So another thing that was happening in this speech that I just got so frustrated about it was that he made repeated mentions of his uncle and when his uncle was president and he was making it sound like his uncle was evident of robust health and that his uncle's presidency also a time of better health for the American people. John F. Kennedy had multiple chronic diseases.
Yeah, and also not a time of great health for people.
No. So John F. Kennedy's various chronic diseases were not publicly discussed much in his lifetime. One would think that being a family member, RFK would have any idea of what was going on. But John F. Kennedy's medical records were released in 2002. He probably had some kind of genetic autoimmune disease. Also, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s aunt Rosemary was given a lobotomy
That's exactly what I was going to mention.
It just made me so angry. He was talking about his own family as though they and the time they were living through was exemplary in terms of health. They lobotomized her. It seems like she did have some kind of intellectual disability, maybe also a mood disorder, but it also seems like some of this lobotomy was about people just not liking her behavior.
Yeah.
And that lobotomy affected her for the rest of her life in a bad way.
Yeah, it was like a shameful thing that was hidden.
Yes. So, some of my notes in this part of the thing are in all capital letters, and there are swear words that we don't say on the podcast. It made me just furious, though. Also, there's a plan to take a number of artificial food dyes out of the food system, or like at least voluntarily do that. Like I said in the intro to the episode, there's a whole can of worms about like what these food dyes may or may not be connected to. But there's discussion of replacing them with so-called natural food dyes. Something being natural doesn't mean that it's better for you or safer. Or
there are a lot of naturally poisonous things in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, if the government in this administration were actually concerned about pollutants that really do make people sicker and air pollution that really does cause disease, if this was actually a concern to the administration, they would not be making big cuts to the EPA.
Right.
And they would not be getting rid of what they say are burdensome regulations on industries.
This makes me feral.
Yeah. It's so angry. If you actually wanted for people to be healthier, maybe a starting point could be universal health care.
Well, that's hippie talk, Tracy.
I know, right?
I mean,
we also didn't put it in I wrote this. I didn't put it in the Crohn's disease discussion, but like, Dwight Eisenhower, 34th president of the United States and also a 5-star general. He had surgery for a bowel issue in 1956, and his symptoms are like it has some consistencies with Crohn's. Again, can't really diagnose people from the past that way, but like he does seem to have had some kind of chronic bowel issue going on.
Right.
Could be in this umbrella. Anyway, we're going to lose our reputation as a podcast that doesn't often say a lot of explicitly political things, but RFK Jr. doesn't know what he's talking about, and he is making dangerous decisions that are going to harm people.
Yeah, 100%.
And I hate it. I hate it.
Deeply.
I hate it. I know people who couldn't get their meds because they were being wrongly used for COVID. Bad stuff. I also know what it's like to have a family member who has a disease so rare that when you go to a neurologist, the specialty related to their rare disease, you have to explain to them the rare disease that your parent has.
Yes.
I hate all of it. I hate it. I hate it.
But do you like it a little?
Not even a little, not even the tiniest bit. I'm going to wind up on some kind of government list, I think. My vocal criticisms of this administration's decisions. Yeah. It's totally possible that air pollution is contributing to rates of various autoimmune diseases.
Yeah.
The solution to that is not to roll back the air quality regulations.
Right. It's also not to cut funding to research.
Or to, try to eviscerate Medicare and Medicaid. And anyway, not happy with a lot of things as they're happening right now. I feel like if I went and took my blood pressure right at this moment, The machine would be like, why? Are you taking your
It would do like a
medication?
Tex Avery cartoon, smoke coming out before it blows up with springy bits coming out of it.
Yeah. So, if you are as riled up about all of this as I am, and you don't already have it and you live in the United States, there's an app called 5 Calls. Will help you with contacting your reps. I also send them physical things in the mail.
Yeah.
And sometimes go out into the street and scream in a group.
Yeah.
And also try to take some moments to ground myself every day. I just got back from a week of vacation in which I had minimal time of looking at the chronic fire hose of news. I was not totally cut off from the news, but it was like less of a continual presence all day long.
Yeah.
And it was a nice little chance for my brain to do some other things.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I vacillate. I feel like so drastically between like trying to run to things that give me joy and then
Oh, sure.
trying to acknowledge and stay on top of all of the horrors.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, I don't know, is this constant like switching bad? I don't know. I can't tell. I don't know the right path.
Yeah. One of the things that I did on this vacation that I was on was that I did some volunteer work, and that really helped with my mind. So if you are able to spend some time with an organization that you believe in, that's doing work that's important to you, if your job or your schedule allows you some time to do that, I spent a couple of hours repackaging an enormous volume of black beans into 2-pound bags of black beans at a food bank. And honestly, it was one of the best things that I did.
I also find like when I have had in my early adult life, like jobs that were kind of like monotonous, laborious jobs, I found those oddly zen and kind of good for my brain.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, unfortunately, they don't pay a living wage often.
Right.
But like, I remember for a while when I was in college in the summers, I would work in resorts cleaning rooms.
Okay.
Which is a hard job.
Yeah.
But there was something very like zen about walking in and being like, okay, I need to make order out of this chaos. It's low stakes. Like, I don't have any emotional attachment to any of this. I can just like get the bedding, get the linens out to the laundry. I can put fresh things down. I can just make this clean and get out. And it was like very good for me. So I often find when I have done volunteer work that's like that, aside from knowing that it's good and, feeling good that you're doing something right, like just doing a repetitive task for a couple hours.
Yeah.
Very
I feel like
zen.
I have seen Allison from the Ask a Manager blog talk about how doing a volunteer task that was very different from her normal work, which is, writing about workplace advice, doing a volunteer thing that was just dramatically different from her day-to-day work life, like really helped with burnout. Because it was a productive task requiring a totally different area of her brain and a totally different style of working than writing about work. I think that's probably good, and I should probably find a way to do more of that in my regular life than when I'm not on vacation.
We talked about the Library of Congress this week.
Indeed.
I sure love it.
Yeah, me too.
There were several times where I got very choked up about it.
Yep.
Because I worked in a library for more than a decade.
Yeah.
And I worked in a university of library that used Library of Congress cataloging.
Me
My
too.
trajectory there was weird because I got hired initially. I've had strange career shifts in my life. I had been working in a salon. I was very tired of it. And I got hired at this university library to repair old books, which they hired me just because in the interview it was apparent that I was very crafty and I was willing to look up methods, the
Right.
things that Library of Congress had developed in terms of preservation. And so I did that and I loved that job. And I was a little too fast about it because then they were like, well, we don't have enough books needing repair to sustain a position anymore. We can either
You fixed them all, Holly.
we can either let you go or we can teach you cataloging. And I was like, cataloging, please. So I was kind of in a paraprofessional role that probably would have benefited from a library science degree, but I did not have one. But I was cataloging a lot, and it's one of those things that I think people who know me were a little like, this is a very anal retentive job. That doesn't seem like your jam. I loved it. I loved cataloging. And then I ended up getting moved over and kind of managing the library's acquisitions after that. And it was just, it was a time in my life where I did not make a lot of money, but I really, really liked my job most of the time. So I have deep fondness for libraries, and particularly Library of Congress cataloging.
I don't clearly remember exactly how this came to be. I think it was when I was in middle school. I was in the strings class. And my middle school had way more kids doing band than doing strings. And somehow the only way to have enough kids for the strings class was to put me, who was in the last year of middle school, into a room with kids that were only in there every other day. So every other day, I needed to be kept occupied some other way. And that some other way was helping in the middle school library. And most of what I did was tidy up and wipe down the tables and shelve books that had been returned or put on the little carts. And sometimes reading the shelves to look for things that were missing.
Yeah. Oh, shelf reading is hard for me.
Yeah. Mis-shelved, incorrectly shelved. And then when I was in high school and we needed to do some kind of service activity for National Honor Society, one of the things I did was the same work in the high school library.
I have questions.
Okay.
Was your middle school library using LC or Dewey? Probably Dewey.
Dewey.
Yeah.
They were both using Dewey. But then in college, the college library was doing Library of Congress.
Yeah.
I've mentioned before I am married to a librarian. I think a lot of people aren't really aware of like the scope of different things that librarians do. Every once in a while, there will be discourse that starts going viral on, TikTok or Instagram Reels or whatever, where someone is looking for a job and doesn't understand why a librarian needs to have a master's degree because they think that what a librarian does is scan the barcode
work
on
the circulation desk. Yeah.
Which might be one of the tasks that a librarian does, but there's also like cataloging and curating the library's collection, being a reference librarian and a resource for the people who come in. My spouse's job as a librarian does not look anything like most people might expect of a librarian because what he's doing is like curating sets of data for researchers.
Yeah.
And if he's going into the stacks for something, it's literally to find a book that I asked for. I don't think he ever goes into the stacks for like the core of his job.
Yeah. And there are a lot of reference librarian positions in places you wouldn't expect that do things like that. Like he works at a university, but like I have had friends that have worked at like the libraries for like big media companies where like their news channel comes to them and is like, I need context for this thing going on now. And they help pull academic journals, sometimes but rarely books, but like, things like newspapers, et cetera, that will help them build a story. Like, that's another thing that reference librarians do.
Yeah.
In those specialty kind of libraries.
It's been a while. We used to get periodically emails from folks who were asking for advice about how to research some, like maybe a family member, and they know that their family member did something related to their local history, or maybe they were involved in a particular battle in World War I or World War II or something like that. Um, and usually my first recommendation to the folks that wrote in would be like, so start by talking to the reference librarian if your local library has a reference librarian.
Yeah. There are some great stories from the reference desk that I have heard over the years.
Yeah.
One of which I will retell in the most nebulous ways so nobody gets in trouble. One of my friends who was working in a university library, so an academic library, had been working with this woman who was older than like your average college age student for a while on various projects. And it had come up in conversation at one point, like, oh, did you decide to go back to school for, work or blah, blah, blah. And that is when we found out that she was in fact doing all of the research and writing of her son's work.
Oh, no.
And it was like, oh, ma'am, this is not what you should be doing at the library.
No.
There is one particular story that I found, charming. I don't know if it's endearing. It's also like, dude, you got to do the thing you got to do. We mentioned that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence had gone to Fort Knox during World War II.
Yep.
But even before that, there had been efforts to get them moved, and that was to the National Archives, which was founded in the mid-1930s. But at that point, Putnam was the Librarian of Congress, and he couldn't bring himself to part with those documents.
Mm-hmm.
And so everyone was like, that's fine. And then he retired in 1939. So everyone was like, okay, now we can move those to the National Archives. But then World War II happened and everything got really busy and dangerous. And so then even once things were going to come back, there were protests from library staff. There was library staff that definitely thought we have been the caretakers of these documents and we want to retain them. And there was a little bit of push and pull over whether they would go to the National Archives, which they eventually did. The Library of Congress also does a lot of very cool programming and has done a lot of very cool programming over the years. One of which is a thing that they did for a while. I don't know if they're still doing it, called their Mostly Lost Films programs, where it would be they would show pieces of films that are not necessarily documented in terms of attribution, who is in them, etc. And the audience could actually help. A lot of cinephiles would go and they would be like, I have seen that actor in this other movie. Can we cross-reference him and figure out his name so that we have credits for this movie? It's a really fun way to crowdsource people who love movies into helping to create more robust and complete records, which I love. And it also sounded like just a super fun way to spend a night out. There are so many fascinating treasures. One of the things that I love in every interview I've ever seen Dr. Carla Hayden do is she talks a lot about the incredible treasures that are actually in the Library of Congress and in libraries in general, and finding them and making sure the public understands what those things are and how they came to be in the library and how they tell the story of us as a people, as a nation, as a global community, etc. There are just some incredibly cool things. The Bay Psalm book, which was published in 1640, is is that the first book that was actually completely published in the North American colonies, I think. But they have one of the only surviving copies of it, which was bequeathed to them. It was loaned to them, I think, in 1965 by Mrs. Adrian Van Sinderen, and then when she passed, it was bequeathed. It was on loan until she died, and then the
mhm.
library took ownership of it officially. But there are a lot of little things like that you think about that are
Yeah.
incredibly rare and interesting that are just lurking in libraries. Some you can't necessarily see. Some are in special collections that like you have to jump through some hoops to get access to for reasons of
Right.
preservation. But it's just incredibly cool stuff in my opinion.
Yeah.
I love a
A
library.
Library of Congress thing that we sort of alluded to in the episode but didn't specifically talk about was the Chronicling America Historical Newspapers collection
Yeah.
that you can get to online, which is jointly done by the Library of Congress and the National Endowment for the Humanities. There have been obviously budget cut and other cut things affecting both of these. The last I saw, there were concerns about whether these cuts meant new items not being added to this collection. And like I don't know if there's been a more recent update on that, but like that's something that I use for the podcast
Yeah.
just continually.
It kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier. I don't think people necessarily realize how much librarians do and how many different sorts of services they
Mhm.
offer. I mean,
Mhm.
even in the case of the Librarian of Congress, there are parts of that job that we might not think of. Like that is who selects the poet laureate, which I'm
Mhm.
sure to some people seems like a very
Esoteric.
lofty, right, like
Mhm.
removed from our immediate day-to-day doings, but like that's an important role because it's a person that represents a moment in time of our history, our communal history, and our written history. And these are important responsibilities in addition to all of the other administrative stuff and being like the final word on decision making and whatnot for the
Mhm.
library. um I really encourage anyone who is interested in Carla Hayden to just do a search for her online because you will find story after story after story of colleagues of hers who talk about her dedication, her understanding of the importance of libraries, her just willingness to do the work, whatever that requires. When she was in
Mhm.
Baltimore working in a library, like it needed a lot of cleanup, and she did not hesitate to get in there and do cleaning shifts with the rest of the staff and make sure that like everything was getting done and that there were just enough people on hand and enough, arms to do the labor
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
she is dedicated, and that's why it really upset me when she was fired. So, lest I cry some more.
Yeah.
um I'm trying to think of another funny library story other than people doing all of the research work for their kids to get a degree that they didn't earn. I still marvel at that one. I'm like, have you thought this through?
Yeah. I
But
feel like that kind of feeds into a bigger conversation that's going on now about like the use of large language models and things like ChatGPT and
yeah.
kids using those to basically write their papers. And it's like the process of writing the paper is what's important
Yeah.
here. Like
Yes.
it the that like that's part of the learning and the demonstration of what you have learned.
Well, and it's like I want to be like, look, I get it. We essentially write a research paper every week, some weeks too,
Yeah.
because that's our job. And it can be arduous. And there are days where you're like, I don't want to. And I understand the impulse to give into that.
Yeah.
But like, I still, in my mid 50s, having done this job for a while, I still feel like I'm learning new ways to research all the time and about
Oh, sure.
new research resources. And
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
of that is both illuminating and enriching. And like the hard parts
Absolutely.
often result in a feeling of growth in terms of even if it's just my grasp of what's available to me. So
Right.
I hate to think of people cheating themselves out of that discovery, but that may
Yeah.
also sound very pie in the sky. I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah. I'm just looking at our production calendar and I just realized it is unplanned that Monday's episode was inspired by that RFK Jr. speech, and this one is inspired by the firing of the Librarian of Congress. Like that, we didn't come together and say, let's have a really political week of the show.
No. And the thing is, right, like, I'm sure there are people for whom, I was thinking about this while I was working on this one, that they'll be like, there are way bigger, scarier things going on than Library of Congress related stuff. And I 100% understand that. This one really hit me because of my background in working in university libraries and my fondness. Listen, I have such fond memories of that AACR2 manual, which is not what's used anymore. That was the Anglo-American cataloging rules. And I loved my AACR2 manual. Now that's, it's replaced. Is it resource description? I don't remember the name of the new manual. I'm sorry. That came out after I stopped cataloging. But like, I think about it because in thinking about that and wondering, like, are people going to think this is an unimportant aspect of the avalanche of tumult that's going on? I remember at a pretty early age, I was either a senior in high school or possibly a freshman in college, but I remember talking to my childhood best friend, and this will sound like the silliest, nerdiest conversation, but we were literally having this conversation about what a miracle a book feels like, because you literally have at your fingertips a portal into someone else's thoughts, and how it is such a unique resource and such an amazing thing. And having those kinds of things available to us, and particularly the efforts that have gone on since Dr. Hayden's appointment to really open the doors of the Library of Congress so everyone has access to an entire universe of being able to tap into the things other people have thought and believed and questioned and discussed, that that's why it sort of hits me very, very hard. It's like, don't close that door. We need that one a lot. Anyway, I'm talking very pie in the sky about my feelings and books, but I hope everybody gets to read lots of books they love. Listen, it doesn't have to be highbrow. Reading is great. It's great therapy. It's great to make your brain happy. It can be very soothing. It can be enlightening.
And if you're reading as audiobooks,
amazing.
Also great.
I'm a big audiobook fan because sometimes my eyes are just tired. We read a lot for our jobs sometimes. If it's my pleasure.
It's true.
My pleasure reading is often audiobooks because I can just sit and I can do stuff in the sewing room or paint something or be driving or whatever, and I still get the information. It makes me very happy. In any case, if this is your weekend coming up and you have time off, I hope that you get to read for pleasure, enjoy an audiobook, whatever makes you happy. I hope that everybody's cool to you and that you can be kind to everyone you encounter and that nobody's a jerk. That may sound like a very high bar, but I'm hoping. I'm going to hope every time. I'm going to be optimistic about it. If it's not your time off, I still hope that everybody's cool to you and that your responsibilities do not preclude you from reading or listening to an audiobook or doing whatever it is that makes you feel refreshed, renewed, revitalized, and enriched. We will be right back here tomorrow with a classic episode, and then on Monday, we will have something brand new that may or may not be inspired by current events.
Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.